There are two ways of healing or liberation or solace or self-help therapy in the world today, and I guess as it has always been. There are two ways, two approaches, two strategies of self-help, of self-healing, of self-help therapy, let's call it that. And on the one hand, you have the spiritual strategy, the spiritual side. On the other hand, you have the emotional side. The two strategies that we have for self-help therapy in today's world are liberation or connection. And they seem quite far apart, and they don't seem to go together very well. But the truth is, in my opinion, they have to go together in a way, and I will talk about it in a phenomenological perspective in this little talk. First of all, let's get to it. The liberation strategy is to, of course, to be free from everything in the human program, which means to be free from the brain. And that is the strategy of Muji, the guru Muji, who is quite famous now, is very big, and it's great what he says. It's wonderful. He's really great. He's insightful. He knows more or less everything about everything, except for the fact that he is, of course, religious. I mean, he calls the thing that we don't know, the thing that we cannot define, the thing that we cannot know what is, he calls that God, because he is more or less a Hindu in a phenomenological sense. I mean, he's coming from the Indian Advaita or Neo-Advaita spiritual tradition. So he's coming from a Hindu Atman Brahman tradition, where Atman is Atman originally is God in man, is the soul. The Atman in the human being is the soul, or the heart soul. The Atman is the heart soul in the human being, and this heart soul is a manifestation of God, or of the divine, or of Brahman in man, because Atman and Brahman is basically, if you really understand it, the same thing. Atman and Brahman is really the same thing. So Brahman is the supreme being who creates everything. Brahman is the supreme being who creates Shiva and Vishnu. Shiva, which is in the Hindu religion, Shiva is the force that manifests everything in the world. Samsara, Shiva is the master of samsara. Shiva is the master and the creator of everything in this world, of nature, of everything that we know of. Shiva is the creator and the destroyer. Shiva is the force that creates the God, or the force that creates everything. And Brahman is the field, the divine supreme field behind Shiva. So Brahman is the ultimate supreme state, which is possible to attain for human beings when we connect to it. It is possible. There's nothing difficult or unnatural about it. It is possible. And Shiva is just the life force, the energy that creates the universe. That's a little bit about the Hindu perspective. So if you're a Hindu, you would connect to your Brahman self, which is more or less the Atman, or the Brahman self is a little bit deeper than the Atman self, actually. There are a little bit fine distinctions here, but the Brahman self is the ultimate supreme being in the world and in the human being. And so that's it. And for Muji, liberation means to be free of absolutely everything, also free from the Brahman self, just be completely free from everything that exists. And when you are free from everything that exists, you will be confronted with the ultimate reality, the thing that cannot vanish, the thing that cannot go away, which means your awareness of nothingness, or your perception of your own consciousness, or the thing that is, the isness of life, the thing that's here, whether we want it or not. Because we are conscious, because we have consciousness, the isness is here. But for Muji, the isness is God, or the Brahman self, or the divine. So that's where he goes wrong, because he calls this truth, but it's not truth, it's religion. So Muji is a religious person who claims that religion is truth, which means that he's basically an amateur, and he cannot really be taken seriously in a scientific perspective, in a serious professional perspective. But in a spiritual perspective, he's great. He's a master, and he's the best. He's really great, wonderful. So he's great as a spiritual teacher and as a spiritual master in a way, but he's an amateur when it comes to understanding himself, because to say that the isness is God is the same thing to be religious, and to be religious is to be blind, because it means that he attaches with his own mind to the same mind phenomena that he doesn't want other people to attach to. So he's playing around in his own kindergarten of words and discourse, in the kindergarten that he advised other people to get out of. But anyway, so the first way of self-help therapy is the liberation, is the spiritual bypass, the spiritual bypass, to suddenly be enlightened and say that, oh, everything that exists is nothing that exists, and nothing is everything, and blah, 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 and it just doesn't matter as long as the light's still on. It's enlightenment is not a piece of knowledge or a piece of understanding. True enlightenment is the way that you relate to supreme knowledge. That is enlightenment. When you have the maturity of relating to supreme knowledge in a mature, or let's say supreme way, then you're enlightened. That's what enlightenment is, and that just takes maturity, and it takes many years, and many people just can't do it because they don't have the formatting in their souls or in their hearts. Perhaps they're not made for that kind of thing. But so Muji represents the liberation strategy, to be free from everything, to be free from absolutely everything, which is a wonderful approach. It's great, and it works. It really works, and it's great. The other strategy is connection, which means Margaret Paul, in a way. Margaret Paul is, in my opinion, maybe the best connection teacher. She's an American psychologist and healer, therapist, who works with what is called inner bonding. The way that you reparent yourself by loving and taking responsibility for yourself at 100%. When it comes to taking care of your inner child, which is you, or the divine, or the Atman self, if you want to put some religion into it. And the wounded self. The wounded self is what Susan Anderson, another great American woman, calls the outer child. She separates between the inner child and the outer child. The inner child is the true feeling, the original emotion. The outer child is how we react, how we respond to experiencing all of this. And the way that we respond, the way that we develop our behavior is, of course, controlled by what Margaret Paul calls the wounded self. The wounded self is the part of us that were damaged in a way, emotionally and psychologically. So we react in a certain way, in the self-sabotaging way of the outer child in us. Now, the inner child is the true spirit, the true emotion, and the outer child is our behavior. And the inner child is always the same thing for deep self-inner healing perspectives. It's what we are. It's our deepest inner child being, our essence. And the wounded self is just how crazy we have become with all our thoughts and ideas, all the false beliefs that we have created in this life as a response to trauma, as a response to things that were difficult and painful for us. So we consist of the inner child and the wounded self, or let's say the inner child and the outer child. And the way to bring this situation into a healing process is to develop what Margaret calls the adult self. The adult self. The thing in us, or the institution in us, or the person in us, or the ability in us that takes responsibility for everything and that can nurture the inner child, protect and nurture and love the inner child, and see through the false beliefs of the wounded self. So the adult self is the manager of the psychological, emotional complex that exists in every one of us. If you want to heal, you have to develop an adult self that is able to relate to the wounded self and to the inner child in an appropriate way. This is the core essence of healing. My last sentence is what it's all about. So if you want to be clear on it, go back and listen to it again. What it's about when it comes to emotional, psychological healing is to develop an adult self who is able to take care of and to be responsible, to take responsibility for the nurturing, protection, and healing and support of the inner child, letting the inner child be what it is, nurture it as it is, letting it love you because it loves you, and it needs love, and it needs attention, and it needs to be listened to, and it needs to be respected. It needs to not be violated, and it needs not to be abandoned. Because in an emotional, psychological perspective, the whole problem of the human suffering or our problems is self-abandonment, how we abandon ourselves. The liberation perspective, the liberation strategy would cut this thing out and would say, yeah, well, that's just a piece of the pie that we have to forget, because the whole pie is just a construction. Just forget it. You're going to make a big mess of your own life if you're going to take responsibility for what's already a mess. Just forget the mess and you'll be much better off. That's the liberation perspective. And I think both are very appropriate. Both are valuable. You have to be able to understand that you're living in a dream and that your life is not real, that it's just your own computer game. You are creating your own life, you are creating your own emotions, you are creating your own thoughts. So at one point you have to understand that your life is a mirage. Your life is your own game, your own movie, your own production, your own drama. And you have to understand that. And you have to understand how you, in interaction with thought and language, creates the false beliefs or the correct beliefs that you create and which controls your life. So you have to see through your whole machinery. You have to see through the human program, which is my work. My work is to bring awareness to the need of understanding the human program fully. That's my work as an artist and as a philosopher. That's what it all boils down to understand the human program fully. And the way that I see it, if you want to understand the human program fully, then you have to some extent combine or see both of these strategies, both the liberation way and the connection way. You have to both understand what connection means and why it's so necessary to us, and why liberation is so necessary to us and so natural for us. And you have to see why liberation means connection on a spiritual plane, and you have to see why connection also means spiritual nourishment. So liberation means connection to something and disconnection from something. Liberation means disconnection from the madness and the suffering and the stress and the anxiety and all the worries that we have about nothing. And connection means connecting to the inner child emotions and to the knowledge of our false beliefs that should not control us. These are the two strategies of self-help: liberation and connection, and both of them should be understood and seen for what they are, because this is the core. The liberation strategy and the connection strategy represents what is necessary when it comes to dealing with the core of the human being, with the essence of who we are, with the existence that we live in. We need liberation, and we should have the knowledge of liberation, that whatever we think is just thoughts, and whatever we think is practically bullshit in a way, and to see the Brahman self, or the void, or the emptiness behind everything, or the space. We don't have to call it emptiness, because for many people that's a negative word. So let's just call it space, or whatever. It doesn't mean much anyway, because the thing that we are doing is to experience our own perception. We experience our own consciousness. And this is my point, because I say that what we humans do is to experience consciousness. We experience our own existence as consciousness and as perception. And this is the core, the inner sanctum of the human program. And because I say this, I am in the middle of the liberation strategy and the connection strategy, or no, I'm outside of it and I'm transcending it because I'm just so fucking great, No, but, well, my point is this, that if you want to understand what the world is about in the 21st century when it comes to self-help therapy and healing, then you have to understand the strategy of liberation and the strategy of connection. The psycho-emotional strategy, psychological emotional strategy, and the spiritual bypass strategy, or the spiritual liberation, which also is a complete mental and cerebral liberation. So these are the aspects that we have to deal with when we make a choice on how we can help ourselves coming closer to what we really want in our life, and to what we need in our life, and to the things in us that represents the most value and meaning and purpose. All right. Thank you. This was a little talk about the liberation strategy and the connection strategy, and a little mentioning of my work, my approach, which is to understand everything about the human program. Okay, thank you.